Hi everyone, so you might have read the video title and already disagree, but hear me out, because I believe I have some valid points. If you're a fan of The Legend of Zelda, especially if you've been playing since the older games, I think this video should be quite interesting to watch, and with that being said, let's get right into it. So before we even begin to talk about why traditional dungeons will never return, we first must know what makes a traditional dungeon traditional. Because everyone's definition is probably a bit different, but I'll give you my definition so that you know what I'm talking about when I say traditional dungeon. For me, a dungeon must tick these 3 boxes to be considered traditional or classic. The first thing is it must have a linear design. So you must progress through the dungeon in a specific way in order to get items that will allow you to move to the next area. The dungeon is designed around being navigated in a very restricted way, where you cannot simply do everything out of order, which is sort of the opposite of the new Legend of Zelda games. Number 2, one way to solve a puzzle. So the only way to solve a puzzle is to do it the intended way, obviously aside from using glitches to cheat, of course. There may be some exceptions to this rule, but even then the amount of ways to solve a puzzle are restricted, and they are all intended ways to solve the puzzle. Number 3, a unique theme. Generally, a traditional dungeon should have its own unique theme. It doesn't have to be elemental, like a water temple or a fire temple, but it should have a theme in which the puzzles are based around. Having a fire theme without fire-based puzzles is not what I would consider a proper theme, but rather a setting in which the puzzles take place in. As you can tell, everything is very controlled, restricted, and everything is designed and made with the intention to be done in a particular way or order. This makes these dungeons far more complex and difficult to figure out, which is one of the big reasons why people want them to return. What I mean by new dungeons are the dungeons in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. The design of these dungeons is essentially mostly the opposite. They have an open-ended design where freedom is the focal point. You can solve them in any order and in any way. You can use abilities to cheat, which is actually an intended way to solve the puzzles. The dungeons are based around you solving them in your way, which is kind of what the new Zelda games focus on as a whole, freedom. Having this freedom is great, however, it comes at the cost of challenge for the most part. Because there are no true limits to how you solve puzzles, that also means that puzzles are much less challenging. There's rarely ever a time where you spend hours and hours on a single puzzle trying to figure out what you are supposed to do. That's mainly because there are so many ways to solve puzzles that you're sure to find a way eventually, because there's not really one thing you're supposed to do. This could be a positive to some and a negative to others. However, if you like challenging dungeons, I'd say it's mostly a negative aspect of the new dungeons. I think there's one reason that sums it up pretty well. I'm not going to mention nostalgia as a reason, by the way. I don't think it makes much sense. I'm going to talk about the dungeon itself. And the main reason that sums it up pretty well, I think it's because they were just epic. Everything from the music to the boss fights to the puzzles and the themes were much more memorable and epic than the new dungeons. Past 3D Zelda games mainly created dungeons as the focal point of the game. The overworld was just a place where you could explore a little and do some side quests in between each dungeon, apart from like maybe Majora's Mask, which it focused a bit more on the overworld than on the dungeons with all the side quests and everything. But besides from that, it was mainly about the dungeons. Therefore, because the focal point were dungeons, they kind of had to be so epic in order for the Zelda games to actually be enjoyable, because that was the main point of Zelda games. And finally, I'm going to talk about why it will never happen and also why it shouldn't happen. People want traditional dungeons in the new style of Zelda games. Now, I'm not saying it's impossible, but just very unlikely and very tough to execute properly. First of all, dungeons are supposed to complement the game, in my opinion. I don't know if people will agree with this, but this is what I think. The new Zelda games, Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, are very open-ended and based around freedom, as I previously mentioned. I can't find a way that classic linear dungeons can be properly implemented in a game which bases its core mechanics and abilities around the complete opposite. Just putting a classic dungeon in a Breath of the Wild style game would be a recipe for disaster, in my opinion. Sure, it would be good if some things were limited or restricted in the new dungeons. For example, I think it was quite a bad decision to allow you to use Zonai capsules in the TOTK dungeons. Not even shrines let you do that. So yeah, I don't think it was a good decision. You can cheat a lot of the puzzles just using Zonai capsules. However, you cannot simply bring back traditional dungeons in a game that does not follow the traditional path or design of traditional Zelda. It just does not work. How would you implement a puzzle that has one way to solve it in a game where the mechanics and abilities are based around having multiple ways to solve puzzles? The only way I can think of is by having all your abilities turned off in dungeons, but I think we can all agree that would be a huge mistake. It would not make sense, as you would have been using these abilities for the entire game, just for the game to take them away from you in the dungeons, which are supposed to be based around using your abilities to solve puzzles. Also, you can't really turn off the core mechanics of the game, so it still wouldn't work. The only way to truly bring back traditional dungeons would be to bring back traditional Zelda as a whole. First of all, that would be a step back from the leap that Nintendo has taken with the Zelda franchise. And besides, Nintendo has already made it very clear that they will not look back at the past with the Zelda franchise, and that they will continue moving forward with it. Now, despite all that I said, I still think that Nintendo can make the new dungeons much better. They can implement some of the things that made traditional dungeons good without bringing them back as a whole. With Tears of the Kingdom, they have definitely made substantial improvements to the dungeons. I didn't hate the Divine Beasts in Breath of the Wild, but they were probably the least interesting part of the game, and also, yeah, they weren't really that enjoyable. They just felt like massive shrines, basically. I still say that's true for Tears of the Kingdom in that the dungeons are probably the least interesting part of the game, but Nintendo have taken some steps to improve the dungeons. Each dungeon has its own theme, and the puzzles are actually based around the theme most of the time, which makes it feel more like a true dungeon. The dungeons also seem to have a bit more combat in them, which I believe is a positive change. I think they still lack combat, but it is definitely better than in Breath of the Wild. Also, the boss fights are much more epic, and each boss fight is unique. Breath of the Wild had the same boss fight with different elemental abilities across all 4 of its dungeons, and I didn't really like that. The best dungeon in Tears of the Kingdom, in my opinion, and I think this is also most people's favourite dungeon, was the Lightning Temple. It was also the dungeon that was closest to being a classic dungeon out of all the dungeons in Tears of the Kingdom. I like the puzzles based around the light, and using the mirrors felt like each puzzle was created very intentionally, similar to traditional dungeons. Meanwhile, you could still use all your abilities, but it didn't feel like cheating. The dungeon only let you use abilities in places where they were intended to be used. You couldn't really use them to bypass puzzles like you could in every other dungeon. There was also a decent amount of combat with the Gibdos, and the boss was alright. It wasn't my favourite, but it was okay. For the next Zelda game, assuming it follows the new Zelda format, which I think Nintendo has already made it clear that it would, I'm sure the dungeons will improve even more. Remember, Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom completely reinvented Zelda as a whole. It's definitely tough for the developers to create amazing dungeons in a format that is so new and different to what they were used to. There is a lot of potential with the open-ended style of Zelda when it comes to dungeons, and I'm certain that we'll see some major improvements in dungeons in the next Zelda game. Now, with that being said, if you do not agree with anything I've said, then make sure to let me know down in the comments below if you think that perhaps traditional dungeons could make a return. And if you couldn't tell by this video, I don't hate traditional dungeons. I actually do like traditional dungeons a lot more than the new dungeons. I'm just trying to tell you guys that it's pretty difficult to implement traditional dungeons in a non-traditional game. It's just not that easy, and I don't think it's actually even possible without taking at least 1 or 2 steps back from the leap forward that the Zelda franchise has taken with the new format of games. So yeah, that's the video. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.